Before her tears could even strike the paper, the ink on her fiancé's cowardly farewell note had already turned to ice. Stranded on her canvas trunk this Christmas Eve, Cora braced herself for the end as the temperature plummeted to a bone-snapping 30 below. The Wyoming wind tore across the plains like a wounded beast, sealing what she believed would be her icy tomb. The Bitter Creek Depot in the winter of 1874 was nothing more than a glorified wooden shack clinging to the edge of the Wyoming Territory. It smelled of sulfur, damp wool, and the bitter tang of raw coal. For 28-year-old Cora Higgins, it was supposed to be the gateway to a new life. Instead, it was shaping up to be her tomb. Cora was a woman of substantial build. In a society that favored delicate, corseted waists and fainting couch fragility, Cora was a mountain of a woman. She was heavy, broad-hipped, and thick-limbed. Back in Chicago, the high society women, whose gowns she painstakingly sewed, would look right through her, treating her as part of the furniture. The men were worse. They either made cruel jokes loud enough for her to hear, or looked at her with blatant, unfiltered disgust. That was why she had answered the advertisement in the matrimonial news. Jebediah Rustin, a rancher from the Wyoming Territory, had written beautifully penned letters speaking of the lonely frontier, of his desire for a companion, a partner to build a homestead with. In her replies, Cora had been painfully honest. "I am not a small woman, Mr. Rustin," she had written, her hand trembling over the parchment. "I am heavy-set, built for endurance rather than display. If you are seeking a porcelain doll, I am not she." Jebediah had replied with what she thought was profound poetry. "The West breaks porcelain, Cora. I need a woman of substance. Come to me." He had paid for her ticket. She had packed her meager savings, her late mother's quilts, and her sewing machine into a sturdy canvas trunk, and she had ridden the rails for 6 grueling days. The train had dumped her at Bitter Creek just as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, taking all the warmth in the world with it. The sky bruised into a violent, stormy purple. Cora stood on the platform, pulling her thin wool coat tighter around her generous frame. She waited as the other passengers were met by cheering relatives and waiting wagons. Soon, only she remained, an imposing figure standing beside a lone trunk. Inside the depot, Station Master Ezekiel Cobb, a wiry, sour-faced man with a permanent scowl, was loudly counting the till. At 7 o'clock, a rider approached through the thickening snow. Cora's heart fluttered like a trapped bird against her ribs. She smoothed her skirts, her frozen fingers numbly checking her hairpins. The rider dismounted his roan gelding. He was tall, dressed in a sharp canvas duster, his face hidden beneath the brim of a Stetson. He didn't come to the platform. Instead, he walked into the depot office. Through the frosted glass window, Cora watched him speak to Ezekiel. She saw the station master point a thumb in her direction. The man Jebediah turned and looked through the glass. Cora offered a hesitant, hopeful smile. Jebediah's reaction was immediate and visceral, his face contorted. Even through the dirty, ice-caked glass, Cora saw the shock, followed instantly by a sneer of pure revulsion. He shook his head violently, slammed a piece of paper onto Ezekiel's counter, turned on his heel, and walked out the back door. Cora watched, paralyzed, as he mounted his horse and rode away into the blinding white snow, never once looking back. A few moments later, Ezekiel Cobb pushed open the heavy wooden door of the depot. He didn't look Cora in the eye. He thrust a folded piece of paper toward her. "He ain't claiming you, miss," Cobb muttered, shifting uncomfortably on his feet. Cora took the paper. Her hands shook so violently she could barely unfold it. There were only 2 lines, scrawled in hasty, furious graphite. "You lied. I paid for a wife, not a draft horse. I leave you to the depot." The words hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. The breath left her lungs in a white plume. But where is he going?" Cora stammered, her voice cracking. "I have no money for a return ticket," he promised. "Not my problem, lady," Cobb said, his voice hardening. "Jeb Rustin is a snake. Everybody knows it. But he ain't breaking no law by changing his mind. Now, I'm closing up. Closing? Cora looked out at the churning vortex of the blizzard. The temperature was plunging rapidly. The wind was screaming across the plains. Mr. Cobb, please. It's Christmas Eve. I'll freeze to death out here. Let me sleep on the floor inside. Just until the morning train. Cobb shook his head, retreating behind the heavy oak door. Company policy, miss. Depot closes at 8 on the dot. No vagrants inside. It's my job on the line. You can sit under the overhang. It'll keep the snow off your head. Please, Cora begged, stepping forward, her heavy boots slipping on the icy planks. Look at the weather. I won't survive the night. Should have thought of that before you came out west, Cobb spat. The door slammed shut. The heavy iron deadbolt slid into place with a sound of utter finality. A moment later, the oil lamps inside were extinguished, plunging the depot and Cora into absolute darkness. She was entirely alone. For the first hour, Cora paced the short length of the covered overhang. The wind whipped around the corners of the building, tearing at her clothes, slicing through her thin wool coat like a barrage of icy razors. She dragged her canvas trunk tightly against the wall to block the wind, but it was futile. By the second hour, the cold began to change. The violent shivering that racked her large frame started to subside, replaced by a terrifying, sluggish numbness. Her hands, thick and capable, felt like blocks of wood. She sat on her trunk, wrapping her arms around her knees, trying to use her own mass to conserve whatever heat she had left. A draft horse. The words echoed in her mind, far colder than the Wyoming wind. All her life, her size had been a curse, a barrier between her and the world. She had thought she was escaping the cruelty of Chicago, only to find a far more lethal cruelty in the West. She wept, but the tears froze instantly on her cheeks, sealing her eyelashes shut with ice. By the third hour, the pain stopped. That was when Cora knew she was dying. A strange, seductive warmth began to bloom in her chest. The screaming wind sounded like a gentle lullaby. She slumped sideways onto the snow-dusted platform, her cheek resting against the freezing wood. Just close your eyes, she told herself. Just for a minute. The storm was a whiteout, a chaotic maelstrom of driving snow that erased the earth and sky. Out of the blinding white, a massive silhouette emerged. It was a horse, but it looked more like a prehistoric beast, a monstrous Shire cross with dinner plate hooves plowing through the chest-deep drifts. Astride the beast sat a man who looked equally carved from the mountain rock. Gideon Mercer didn't come to town often. He lived deep in the Wind River Range, a solitary existence defined by trapping, hunting, and silence. At 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, Gideon was a man people avoided. A jagged, faded scar ran from his left temple down to his jawline, a souvenir from a grizzly bear that hadn't survived the encounter. He had ridden down to Bitter Creek to collect a shipment of black powder and salt that had been delayed on the trains. Finding the depot completely dark and locked up tight irritated him, but it was the lump on the platform that made him stop. At first, through the swirling snow, he thought Ezekiel Cobb had left a shipment of flour sacks out to ruin. But as he swung down from his massive horse, the wind shifted, revealing the edge of a wool skirt. Gideon waded through the drifts and stepped onto the platform. He knelt beside the snow-covered mound. With a heavy, gloved hand, he brushed the snow away, revealing the pale, frostbitten face of a woman. She was large, her frame taking up a significant portion of the platform. She was completely unresponsive, her lips a terrifying shade of blue, her breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Gideon didn't hesitate. He stripped off his massive bear-hide outer coat. He slid his thick arms under her back and beneath her knees. Even with her substantial weight, Gideon lifted her with a grim, effortless strength. He wrapped his massive, heat-radiating fur coat entirely around her. Cora felt a sudden jolt, a shifting of gravity. Her eyelids fluttered open, heavy with ice. Through a blurry, darkening haze, she saw the face of a giant looming over her. His features were sharp, rugged, bisected by a wicked scar. His eyes, A startling, piercing gray stared down at her with an intensity that burned through the cold. She thought it was an angel of death, or perhaps the devil. Jebediah? She managed to whisper, her voice barely a rattling croak. Gideon's jaw tightened. No, he said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated in her chest. My name is Gideon. You're freezing to death, woman. Left me. Cora mumbled deliriously, the hypothermia confusing her brain. Too big, said I was. Too heavy. She expected him to drop her. She expected the stranger to realize she was a burden and leave her on the planks. Instead, Gideon pulled her tighter against his broad chest. You're just right to survive this storm, he murmured fiercely. He leaned in close, his breath warm against her frozen ear. You can give up and let the snow have you, or you can come home with me. Choose. Cora looked up into those storm-gray eyes. The sheer will in them tethered her to the earth. She managed a microscopic nod. Home, she breathed, before blacking out completely. Gideon carried her to his horse. He hoisted her up into the saddle, climbing up behind her and wrapping his arms securely around her waist to keep her from falling. He spurred the giant horse forward, leaning into the teeth of the blizzard. The ride was a blur of agony and strange comfort for Cora. She drifted in and out of consciousness. The cold was a physical agony as her body began to instinctively fight for life, drawing on the immense, furnace-like heat radiating from the man behind her. He held her with a terrifying strength, his grip unyielding, anchoring her to the world of the living. When she finally awoke with clarity, the howling wind was muffled. She was lying on a massive bed, draped in heavy furs. The smell of burning pine and wood smoke filled the air. Firelight danced across log walls. Panic seized her. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt like lead. She looked down and realized she had been stripped of her frozen, wet outer garments. She was wearing a massive, impossibly large flannel shirt that swallowed her entirely, reaching down past her knees. You're awake, Cora flinched, pulling the thick fur blanket up to her chin. Gideon Mercer stepped out of the shadows. In the firelight, he looked even more intimidating. He was stripped down to a woolen union suit, tending to an iron stove in the corner. He walked over to her, carrying a tin cup steaming with broth. Drink, he commanded softly, holding it out. Cora hesitated, her innate self-consciousness rushing back. She was a heavy woman, sitting half-dressed in a stranger's bed. The memory of Jebediah's disgusted face flashed in her mind. She waited for the mockery. She waited for Gideon to look at her thick arms and broad shoulders with the same revulsion. But as Gideon handed her the cup, his gaze held nothing but a quiet, assessing respect. You have a strong heart, he said simply. Most women from the East would have been dead 2 hours before I found you. Your body kept you alive. Cora took the cup, her hands shaking so badly the broth sloshed over the rim. You saved me. Why? Gideon walked over to a scarred wooden table and sat down, methodically cleaning a Winchester rifle. I don't let things die on my doorstep, miss, especially not on Christmas. My name is Cora, she whispered, taking a sip of the scalding, life-giving broth. Cora Higgins. Gideon paused in his cleaning. He looked up, his gray eyes locking onto hers. Higgins, you said a name when I found you. Jebediah. Cora looked away in shame, staring into the dark broth. Jebediah Rustin. I was his mail-order bride. He took one look at me and left me there. A sudden, chilling silence filled the cabin. The crackle of the fire seemed to amplify. Cora looked up. Gideon had gone perfectly still, his large hands gripping the rifle so tightly his knuckles were white. Did you say, Jebediah Rustin? Gideon asked, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a dangerous, lethal edge. Cora nodded fearfully. Yes. Do you know him? Gideon didn't answer immediately. He stood up, towering in the small cabin. He walked over to a small wooden lockbox resting on the mantel. He opened it, pulling out a folded piece of heavy parchment. He walked back to the bed and tossed it onto the blankets beside her. Cora picked it up with a trembling hand. It wasn't a deed. It wasn't a letter. It was a bounty poster from the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Wanted, Dead or alive, Jebediah Rustin, alias Jebediah Vance, for the murder of Sarah Mercer. Cora's blood ran cold, colder than it had been on the depot platform. She looked up at the giant mountain man. Gideon's eyes were completely devoid of warmth now. They were the eyes of a wolf cornering its prey. "Sarah was my sister," he said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "I've been hunting that man across 3 territories for 2 years. And you, Miss Higgins, you just brought him right to my front door." The fire popped, sending a shower of orange sparks against the iron grate, but the cabin felt entirely devoid of heat. Cora stared at the crumpled Pinkerton poster on her lap. The sketched face of Jebediah Rustin stared back at her, his cold, dead eyes perfectly captured in charcoal. "He killed her for a 60-acre land deed in the Dakota Territory," Gideon said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He didn't look at Cora. He stared into the fire, his hands gripping the edges of the mantel until the wood groaned. "Married my sister Sarah under a false name, poisoned her with arsenic 2 months later, sold the land to a railroad syndicate, and vanished. By the time I found her grave, he was a ghost." Cora's hands trembled, not from the cold, but from a sudden, sickening clarity. The shame that had weighed her down at the depot began to fracture, replaced by a cold, sharp horror. "He paid for my ticket," Cora whispered, piecing the puzzle together. "In his letters, he asked so many questions about my family in Chicago. My mother had just passed. I told him she left me everything. I meant her quilts and her sewing machine. But he thought you meant an estate," Gideon finished, turning to look at her. "He targets lonely women with inheritance. He brings them to the frontier where there's no law, marries them, and buries them." "Then why leave me at the station?" Cora asked, her voice cracking. "If he's a murderer, why didn't he just take me into the dark and kill me?" Gideon walked over to the bed, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over her. He looked at her carefully, his storm-gray eyes assessing her broad shoulders, her thick wrists, the undeniable solid mass of her. "Because he's a coward who preys on the weak. Sarah was frail. A stiff wind could knock her over. You?" A ghost of a smirk touched Gideon's scarred lips. "You stepped off that train looking like a woman who could break him in half if he tried to put his hands on your throat. You didn't look rich, and you didn't look like an easy kill. Your size saved your life, Cora." The words hung in the air. Your size saved your life. For 28 years, Cora's body had been her greatest source of humiliation, the reason she was mocked, ignored, and left to freeze. Now, this giant of a mountain man was telling her it was her armor. A spark of something entirely new ignited in Cora's chest. Anger. Pure, unadulterated, righteous fury. "My coat," Cora said suddenly, pushing the heavy fur blankets aside. "Where is it?" Gideon pointed to a wooden chair near the stove where her damp clothes were steaming dry. Cora hauled herself up. Her legs were shaky, her feet tender from the frostbite, but she forced herself across the room. She dug into the pocket of her wool coat and pulled out a bundle of letters bound in twine. "He's careful," Gideon said, watching her intently. "The Pinkertons have been hunting him for 3 years. He never stays in one place, and he never uses his real address. I tracked him to Bitter Creek, but the snow wiped out his trail an hour before I found you." "He is careful," Cora agreed, her eyes scanning the familiar, elegant handwriting that had once filled her with hope. "But he is also a narcissist. He liked to brag about his ranch to make himself sound grand." She flipped through the damp pages until she found the last letter. "Here," he wrote, "I wait for you at my homestead, where the shadow of the Devil's Gate falls across the frozen river and the old silver carts rot in the canyon." Gideon stepped closer, snatching the letter from her hands. His eyes scanned the ink. "Devil's Gate. The Sweetwater River. There's an abandoned silver mining camp up in the Granite Mountains, about 2 days' ride north. The prospectors called it Dead Man's Gulch. Can you find it?" Cora asked. "I can," Gideon said, walking over to a wooden trunk and pulling out a heavy canvas coat and a box of Winchester ammunition. "I'll leave you enough firewood and salted meat to last a week. When the train track's clear, I'll come back and take you to the depot." "No," Cora said. Gideon paused, half-turned toward the door. "No, I am going with you," Cora said, squaring her broad shoulders. She stood at her full height, her chin raised. "He left me to freeze like a stray dog. He murdered your sister. I am the only living witness who can place him at Bitter Creek, making him a flight risk. You need me to identify him to the marshal." "It's 20 below zero out there, woman," Gideon growled, stepping into her space. He was taller, but Cora didn't flinch. "It's a grueling ride. It will break you. I sat in 30 below weather for 4 hours and survived." Cora shot back, her dark eyes flashing with a fierce, untamed fire. "I am not porcelain, Mr. Mercer. I don't break." Gideon stared down at her for a long, heavy moment. The annoyance in his eyes slowly melted into something else, a deep, resounding respect. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing a stray lock of hair away from her cheek. "Wrap your feet in burlap before you put your boots on," he murmured. "We ride in 10 minutes." The trek north was a brutal test of endurance. They rode double on Gideon's massive Shire cross, plowing through snowdrifts that reached the horse's chest. The Wyoming wind howled, but Cora barely felt it. She was pressed tight against Gideon's broad back, her arms wrapped around his solid waist. He radiated heat like an iron stove, and for the first time in her life, Cora didn't feel self-conscious about her body pressing against a man's. She realized he needed her warmth just as much as she needed his. On the second night, they camped in a shallow cave hidden behind a frozen waterfall. Gideon built a small, smokeless fire. As they shared a tin of heated beans, Gideon looked at her across the flames. The firelight danced over her strong jaw and thick neck. "You haven't complained once," Gideon noted, his voice quiet over the whistling wind. "Would it make the snow melt faster if I did?" Cora asked, taking a bite. Gideon let out a low, rumbling chuckle. It was a beautiful sound. "Most women I know would be crying for their mothers by now. My sister Sarah, she was like a little bird, delicate. The world was too sharp for her." He looked down at his scarred hands. "I should have protected her." Cora reached out across the fire, her large, capable hand covering his. "You are protecting her now, Gideon, by stopping him." He turned his hand over, interlacing his thick fingers with hers. He didn't let go for the rest of the night. At dawn, they reached Dead Man's Gulch. The abandoned mining camp was a graveyard of rotting wooden shacks and rusted iron machinery buried in the snow. At the far end of the canyon, a thin ribbon of gray smoke curled from the chimney of the old assay office. Gideon tied the horse to a dead pine tree a quarter-mile out. He pulled his Winchester lever-action rifle from its scabbard. "You stay here," he ordered in a whisper. "When the shooting starts, keep your head down." Cora nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched Gideon move through the snow like a hunting panther, silent and deadly, despite his massive size. He approached the front door of the assay office. He didn't knock. With one brutal kick of his heavy boot, Gideon shattered the door right off its iron hinges. "Rustin!" Gideon roared, raising the rifle. But Jebediah Rustin was a survivor of his own vile making. He had been expecting the law, not a mountain man, and he had slept with a loaded shotgun across his chest. As the door splintered, Rustin fired blindly from the shadows. The roar of the shotgun echoed through the canyon. Gideon grunted, spinning backward into the snow as a spray of buckshot grazed his left shoulder and tore through his heavy coat. He dropped to one knee, trying to cycle the lever of his Winchester with a bleeding arm. Rustin burst through the doorway, his eyes wild, dropping the empty shotgun and drawing a silver Colt revolver from his belt. He aimed it directly at Gideon's head. "Don't know who you are, friend," Rustin sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger, "but you picked the wrong." He never finished the sentence. Cora hadn't stayed with the horse. She had crept along the side of the building, her heavy boots crunching softly in the snow. When she saw Rustin point the gun at Gideon, all logical thought vanished. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. With a ferocious roar, Cora lunged from the corner of the building. She threw her entire body weight, every pound of the mass she had hated for 28 years, directly into Jebediah Rustin. The impact was devastating. It was like a runaway freight cart slamming into a scarecrow. Rustin let out a breathless shriek as Cora's shoulder caught him square in the ribs. The sickening crack of his ribs breaking echoed in the cold air. The revolver flew from his hand into a snowbank as Cora drove him forcefully to the frozen ground. She landed on top of him, pinning him entirely beneath her substantial bulk. Rustin thrashed and clawed, panic in his eyes, but he couldn't budge her. Cora grabbed him by the lapels of his coat, her face inches from his, her dark eyes blazing with the fury of every woman he had ever wronged. "I'm the draft horse," Cora hissed through her teeth, her knee digging into his chest. "Remember me?" Rustin stared up at her in absolute, abject terror. He couldn't breathe under her weight. He squeaked, his face turning a mottled purple. A shadow fell over them. Gideon stood there, his left arm dripping blood into the snow, but his right hand held the Winchester aimed squarely between Rustin's eyes. "You can get off him now, Cora," Gideon said, breathing heavily. A fierce, proud smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Before you crush him to death, the law needs him breathing." 2 days later, they rode into the bustling town of Cheyenne and dragged a battered, broken-ribbed Jebediah Rustin into the office of U.S. Deputy Marshal Frank Canton. The legendary lawman took one look at the Pinkerton poster, then at Rustin, and locked him in irons without a word. Canton handed Gideon a heavy leather pouch containing $1,000 in reward money. Gideon didn't even look at the gold. He tossed the pouch to Cora. "Buy yourself a new sewing machine," he said gruffly, "the biggest one they have." They stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the marshal's office. The Wyoming sun was finally shining, melting the snow and turning the streets to mud. Cora looked at the heavy pouch in her hands, then up at the giant mountain man who had saved her life. "I have money now," Cora said softly, her heart pounding. "I could buy a ticket back to Chicago or San Francisco." Gideon stepped closer, oblivious to the townspeople walking past them. He reached out, his large hands gently framing her face. He didn't care who was watching. He looked at her not as a burden, not as a curiosity, but as a queen. "You told me you didn't break," Gideon whispered, his gray eyes burning into hers. "Neither do I. We're carved from the same mountain, Cora. Chicago doesn't deserve you." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "Come home with me, for good." Cora closed her eyes, a warm tear slipping down her cheek this time. It didn't freeze. She leaned into his touch, her heart finally finding its anchor. "Take me home, Gideon," she whispered. If Cora's incredible journey of survival, strength, and unexpected love in the harsh Wyoming wilderness kept you on the edge of your seat, we want to hear from you. Hit that like button to support true Western grit. Share this story with someone who loves a fierce heroine, and subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking historical dramas and real-life tales. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a wild ride.
Hi, my name is Prairie Rose, the owner and manager of Obese Girl, Oregon. After watching the video, left to freeze at the depot on Christmas night until a mountain man whispered, "Come home with me," I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the quiet warmth that can come from a single act of compassion. Even when life feels cold and uncertain, being willing to help someone can make all the difference. It's a gentle reminder to notice people who may need a little kindness. Do you think you would have made the same choice as the mountain man? What part of this story stayed with you the longest? If it gave you something to reflect on, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more.